Who is your hero? Who is the person you admire most, look up to the most, seek to emulate with your life? You know, when we're little, we admire our mom or our dad. Maybe we have a favorite teacher or another adult that we really look up to as we grow up. Maybe as young adults, there's someone in our workplace who really has their stuff together, or a friend or someone else we know that we think, well, when I grow up, when I really grow up, I want to be just like them. But today, more than ever before, we let famous people be our heroes. And that's been true for a long time, but it's never more true than now. It's athletes, it's movie stars, it's rock stars, it's political leaders, it's CEOs, it's podcasters. These are the people who teach us how to dress, what to eat, how to vote, how to think. We hang on their every word. And not to say that all of these people are bad people, but we don't know them, so we can't evaluate their character. We don't know what they're really like. There's one particular influencer whose name I will not mention because I don't want anybody to go look him up and give him more publicity. But this particular influencer has 10 million plus followers, most of them young men or teenage boys, and they learn from him how to get rich, how to get ripped, how to get women. And this particular influencer has, I believe the last count is 42 active indictments for rape and human trafficking. He's been banned from multiple nations, but we took him in, yay, America. And recently he converted to Islam because he hates Israel and he thinks they know how to keep women in their place. Now, I don't want my son following after somebody like that. I doubt you do either. But this is what I'm talking about. Character matters. You might say, well, what's wrong with me liking somebody because they're good at football or because they make good movies or because I enjoy the show that I listen to when I'm on my way to work? Nothing wrong with admiring the way someone does their job. Most people who are famous, not all, most people who are famous because they're good at something. Not all, but some. Nothing wrong with that, but when you let them teach you how to live, when they become your hero, because who you idolize determines who you become. What we reverence is what we end up resembling every single time. And you can say that you're a believer in Jesus, and I believe you, but if your hero is somebody else, you might have a problem because character matters. We're going to study today in this continuing study of the kings and prophets of Old Testament Israel. We're going to study a guy lesser known than many of the ones we've talked about so far. His name is Jehu. Jehu had many elements of a hero, many heroic things about him. He was brave. He was decisive. He hated the corrupt leaders of Israel, and he took action. And when you hear this story, and for those of you who are a little more tender-hearted, those of you who are less inclined to watch, say, movies like Braveheart, this message, this story is going to be hard to hear. There's a high body count. The Bible includes some pretty graphic details, and I'm not going to shy away from those. But for those of you who enjoy Braveheart, and I have to admit it's in my top 10 list, you might enjoy this story. But does that make Jehu a hero worth following? What is his true character? And along the way of deciding, okay, what kinds of people should we emulate, should we admire, we're going to ask the question, what does it mean to be a truly good person? What are the three qualities that Scripture tells us make up good character? So I need for you to stick with me because there's a lot in this message. We're going to read a lot of Scripture, and I need to give you some background with some names that you may not be familiar with. 3 names right off the top, and the first name is Joram. Joram, at the start of this story, is the king of Israel. Remember, Israel is separated into 2 nations. There's the kingdom of Judah in the south, where the sons, the ancestors of David, or the descendants of David, continue to reign. And then there's Israel to the north. The king of Israel is Joram. Joram's mom and dad, you've probably heard of, Ahab and Jezebel, the worst set of rulers that Israel ever had. Ahab, by this time, is already dead. He's died in battle, but Jezebel is still around, still exerting her wicked influence over the nation. Joram is just like his dad and has not departed from any of those sins. So that's the first character you need to understand. The second is not really in this story, although he's mentioned. He's a guy named Naboth. Naboth was an Israelite farmer. He had a piece of land that was adjacent to Ahab's land. And Ahab wanted that land. He thought, if I just had Naboth's land, then I'd have this big piece of property, and I could plant all kinds of crops. I could do whatever I wanted to. And he went to Naboth and said, sell me your land. Here's what you need to understand. Here's what's different. One of the many things about Old Testament Israel that's different than America today. Today, you buy land all the time. If somebody owns a horse farm on the edge of Willis, and somebody comes to them and says, hey, I want to buy your horse farm and build 50 houses there, you sell, right? That's what people do. I wish you wouldn't, but you do. But in Israel, it was different. This was not a mere economic decision. God had said, listen, land in Israel is not to be sold. It can be leased, but it's not to be sold. You know why? Because God wanted every family to have a homestead. Every family to have, at bare minimum, you have a place where you can plant your crops. That way there would never be any destitute families. And so Naboth, in obedience to the Lord, said, I can't sell you my land. It's my inheritance from the Lord. It belongs to my family. And Ahab goes home and pouts and sulks, and his wife Jezebel comes up and says, hey, you're the king. Let's figure something out. So they concoct a conspiracy in which Naboth is accused of a crime falsely, and he is executed by stoning. He dies a traitor's death, falsely, unjustly, and Ahab swoops in and takes his property. Naboth's kids are too young to say anything about it, so he just takes it. And because he's king, he gets away with it, he thinks. But God sees and God knows. So remember Naboth. Third character in the story is Ahaziah. He's the king of the southern kingdom of Judah. So he's a descendant of David, but the poisoned blood of Ahab and Jezebel has gotten its way into the Davidic bloodstream because Ahaziah's grandfather, Jehoshaphat, who was one of the great kings of Judah, was dumb enough to marry his son to a daughter of Jezebel named Athaliah. Remember that name? We'll talk about her next week. You'll see what she's like. But that means that Ahaziah and Joram are the kings of both Israel and Judah, and they're both idol worshipers, and they're both evil men. And this is a terrible time to be following the Lord in Israel. Now, we'll pick up the story there in 2 Kings 9, 6 through 7. But one last piece of background. So you remember a few weeks ago when Elijah had his moment of depression when he wanted to die, and God said, get up from there and go anoint Elisha to be your follower, and then go anoint Jehu to be king over Israel. So he anoints Elisha. We saw Elisha last week in the story of Elisha and Naaman. But now Elisha follows up on what God told Elijah to do. He sends one of his proteges to anoint a guy named Jehu to be king of Israel. Jehu is just a military commander, just an officer in the army. And out of nowhere, while he's eating and drinking with his fellow commanders and officers, this wild-eyed prophet shows up and anoints him as king. Now, we'll pick up that story there. And the young man poured the oil on his head, saying to him, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anoint you king over the people of the Lord, over Israel. And you shall strike down the house of Ahab your master, so that I may avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord. Remember, Jezebel has killed all but 100 of the prophets of the Lord in the land. She has done unspeakably terrible things, and God has promised that she would pay. And Jehu will be his blunt instrument of judgment. And Jehu is a man of action. He knows what his orders are. He relishes those orders. He doesn't have to be told twice. He immediately sets out for the city of Jezreel, where King Joram and his mother Jezebel reign. And it just so happens that his cousin Ahaziah has come to visit him that day. Do you think it's any coincidence that this is the day God chooses to anoint Jehu as king? So Jehu sets off for Jezreel, where these two kings are having their little meeting, their little tea party, and here's what happens. So I love the details in this story. That's why I'm reading such a long passage. Chapter 9, verse 17 says, now the watchman was standing on the tower in Jezreel, and he saw the company of Jehu as he came and said, I see a company. And Joram said, said, take a horseman and send to meet them, and let him say, is it peace? So a man on horseback went to meet him and said, thus says the king, is it peace? And Jehu said, what do you have to do with peace? Turn around and ride behind me. And what's happening here is they're sending out messengers. The messengers get to Jehu and they realize, oh, Jehu's not coming to consult with King Joram. He's coming to kill King Joram. And I'm pretty glad about that. So I'm not going to go back and report to the king so he can flee. I'm going to just ride alongside. It kind of gives you an idea of what's going on in the kingdom of Israel at the time, how people feel about their ruler. And the watchman reported, saying, the messenger reached them, but he is not coming back. Then he sent out a second horseman who came to them and said, thus the king has said, is it peace? And Jehu answered, what do you have to do with peace? Turn around and ride behind me. Again, the watchman reported, he reached them, but he is not coming back. And the driving is like the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously. I love that detail because he's saying, listen, I can't even see the guy's face, but I know how Jehu drives. You get the impression that if Jehu was alive today, he would be dangerous on I-45, right? Maybe some of you can identify. I'm not judging, I'm just saying. Now, it says in verse 21, so Joram said, make ready. And they made ready his chariot. Then Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, set out, each in his chariot, and went to meet Jehu, and met him at the property of Naboth the Jezreelite. Remember that name. So this is the land that Joram's dad stole from Naboth after having him falsely accused and executed. This is where they happened to meet. Not coincidence. And when Joram saw Jehu, he said, is it peace, Jehu? He answered, what peace can there be so long as the whorings and the sorceries of your mother Jezebel are so many? You see, yo mama things are not new, all right? This goes back 3,000 years at least. And I don't know that there's ever been a better yo mama than that one right there. Then Joram reigned about and fled, saying to Ahaziah, treachery, O Ahaziah. And Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and shot Joram between the shoulders so that the arrow pierced his heart and he sank in his chariot. Now let's skip down to verse 27. When Ahaziah, the king of Judah, saw this, he fled in the direction of Beth Hagan, and Jehu pursued him and said, shoot him also. And they shot him in the chariot at the ascent of Gur, which is by Ablim, and he fled to Megiddo and died there. So in one fell swoop on a single day, Jehu has just assassinated the kings of both Israel and Judah, but he's not done. Verse 30 says, when Jehu came to Jezreel. So this all happens on the outskirts of the town. He goes into the city where Jezebel is waiting for him. And get ready, because she's about to get all Tammy-Fayed up. So when Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out the window. And as Jehu entered the gate, she said, is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master? Now, I just can't help myself. I have to explain all these little references. Zimri was a guy who in an earlier generation, an Israelite army officer, just like Jehu, had assassinated the king and had himself become king. However, after only 7 days, he was besieged by another army officer and chickened out and burned the house down around himself. So he reigned 7 days. The army officer who killed Zimri was Omri, Jezebel's father-in-law. So there's a lot of backstory here. There's a lot of, you get it. She's insulting him. She's saying, yeah, you killed my son. You're probably going to kill me, but you're not going to last. Somebody's going to get you probably within a week. Again, is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master? So she's looking down from this window in this tower, and he lifted up his face to the window and he said, who is on my side? Who? 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him. He said, throw her down. So they threw her down, and some of her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled on her. Then he went in and ate and drank, and he said, See now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter. But when they went to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. When they came back and told him, he said, "This is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. In the territory of Jezreel, the dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the face of the field in the territory of Jezreel, so that no one can say, 'This is Jezebel.'" And he's still not done. Because then he goes rambling through the northern kingdom, finding whoever he can find who has any connection to Ahab. He comes across 42 relatives of King Joram who don't have the breaking news alerts on their phones, right? They don't know that the king has just been killed. So he comes and he says, "Who are you?" They say, "Well, we're relatives of King Joram. We're come to visit him." Kill them all. And he does. He hunts down every person sympathetic to the former king and puts them to death. Then he surrounds the capital city and he says to the elders there, "Listen, I'm going to burn this whole city to the ground unless you kill every son of Ahab." There were 70 sons of Ahab. Jezebel wasn't his only wife. So pretty soon there's a pile of 70 heads of sons of Ahab, because the people do the math and they know he means business, and he's still not done. He then, after he's wiped out everybody associated with Ahab, he then goes to the temple of Baal. He says to the people of Israel, "If you're a worshiper of Baal, I want to show you that I love Baal even more than Ahab did. Come gather, we're going to have a worship service." They all gather and he burns the place to the ground and they all die. This is Jehu, okay? Now, again, this is William Wallace, right? This is Braveheart stuff. Only, spoiler alert, in Braveheart, William Wallace dies. This is if William Wallace won and burned the Tower of London and killed the King of England, and today all us English speakers have this cool Scottish accent. But that's not what happened in real history. It was what happened in Israel. Jehu completely defeated the forces of evil. But is he a good man? I'll let the biblical writer tell us. Verse 29 of chapter 10 says, "But Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. That is, the golden calves that were in Bethel and in Dan. And the Lord said to Jehu, because you've done well in carrying out what was right in my eyes and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel to sin. In those days, the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel." So yes, Jehu was a blunt instrument against God's enemies, but he was a terrible king, just as bad as the ones that came before him. By the time of his grandson, who reigned over Israel, the army of Israel consisted of 10 chariots and 50 horsemen. That's it. And every king after this died violently. I mean, there was never, after his four generations of Jehu and his sons, after that, every king was assassinated. There was constant turmoil, there was constant unrest, and eventually Israel itself was consumed by the Assyrian Empire. And you might say, yeah, but God chose him. Why would God choose someone who wasn't righteous? Listen, this is a theory of mine. I think it's got biblical backing, but I can't prove it. That's why I'm telling you it's a theory. But my theory is sometimes God gives us the rulers we deserve. Not necessarily the ones we need, not the ones we want, but the ones we deserve. Sometimes the ruler we have is not God's savior, but God's judgment. And that was Jehu. So what do I mean when I say good character? What consists of good character? This is when I really start preaching and not just storytelling. What should we look for in our leaders? What should we look for in our heroes? What should we aspire to ourselves? I think one of the most concise depictions of good character is Micah 6:6-8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Remember what we said last week when Naaman came to Israel. He thought that God was like the pagan gods he'd been raised with, who are essentially mob bosses. You can buy them off. Doesn't matter if you're a good person. Doesn't matter if you love others. Doesn't matter your character at all. If you bow the knee, if you kiss the ring, if you bring a big offering, then God's satisfied with you and everything's fine. And what Micah's saying is the people of Israel continue to think this way. If I just offer this great sacrifice, if I just give this big donation, then I can get away with whatever I want. And what Micah says is God doesn't want those things unless they come from a true heart. He says in verse 8, he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before your God. Now, those are three things: justice, kindness, humility. Let's define them real quickly, and then we're done. Justice is closely linked to righteousness, which righteousness just essentially means doing the right thing, being in accordance with God's character. But justice has a different slant. Justice means specifically that you are actively improving the lives of people around you who have less, people who others ignore or even take advantage of. In the Old Testament, there were three people that came up again and again and again. Whenever God talked about justice, he always mentioned these three groups of people, and they were the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. Why? Because those are three groups that had no power. They had nobody to speak for them, to advocate for them. They usually had very little money. They had no way of making money. If you were the kind of person who was inclined to do so, you could take advantage of an orphan, a widow, a foreigner who lived in your midst. You could do whatever you wanted to, and no one would hold you accountable. But God held you accountable. And God said to Israel again and again, listen, if you want to be a nation that lasts, if you want to be a nation that's blessed by me, I'm keeping my eye on how you treat the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus terms these same people by a different term. He calls them the least of my children. That famous parable in Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. He says, listen, on the day of judgment, the people who will stand pure are the ones who are kind to the least of my children. Because what you've done for them, you've done for me. What you've withheld from them, you withheld from me. A truly good person, a person worthy of respect and admiration, a hero, is someone who does justice. Number two, to love kindness. To love kindness means more than being a nice person. Now, many of you would say, well, I try to be a nice person, and I'm glad. You know what? I would rather pastor a church full of nice people than a church full of rude people. A church full of jerks. I've never pastored that kind of church. I can imagine what it's like because I've known enough jerks. But what is niceness? Niceness is simply a social code that says, I do these things, I say these things, I behave this way so that I won't offend you, so that you'll like me, so that I'll keep the peace. Again, that's not nothing. That's how society functions. But kindness goes further. Kindness actually says, what would I need someone to do for me if I were in your shoes? Kindness serves others, even people who don't deserve it, even people who don't treat you with kindness in return. Kindness sometimes doesn't even feel nice. If you saw some sin in me that I was unrepentant of, and you confronted me about it. Let's say I was really rude to someone in this church, and you saw it, and you saw that I really hurt that person, and that I just seemed to walk on and not even acknowledge it. And you came to me later and said, Jeff, you were rude to her, you were rude to him, you need to go back and apologize. Nice people don't do things like that because nice people would be afraid that it would hurt my feelings or make me angry or that our friendship would be ruptured. But a kind person says, you can hate me if you want to, but I'm going to do what I would want someone to do for me if I were in your shoes. To do kindness, to love kindness is how you become a good person. And the third thing is to walk humbly with your God, which is the hardest of the three, I believe. And humility, we talked about it some last week. It has nothing to do with thinking lowly of yourself. It's not thinking of yourself at all. It is an utter lack of self-centeredness. And we have a great example in the history of our country. You ever ask yourself why George Washington is on the dollar bill, why he's on Mount Rushmore, why every historian's list of the greatest presidents always has George Washington at the top? All those historians will tell you, it's not because he was a great military leader. The fact is George Washington lost more battles than he won. It's not because he was exceptionally eloquent. You want eloquence? That's Thomas Jefferson. That's Ben Franklin. That's Andrew Hamilton. It's not because he was brilliant intellectually. There are two things George Washington did that sealed his greatness. The first one is at the end of the Revolutionary War, when he had completed one of the all-time great military upsets, had overcome the biggest and baddest military empire on the planet. He had won independence for 13 ragtag colonies. And at that point, history says what you're supposed to do is what Julius Caesar did, what Cromwell did, what Napoleon would later do. You march on the Capitol and you surround the legislature and you say, okay, I'm in charge now, make me dictator for life. But George Washington said, I did what you called me to do. I'm going back to my farm in Mount Vernon. He walked away from power. And that was an act so stunning that when King George III of England heard about it, he literally said, if he actually did that, he's the greatest man on earth. And the second thing George Washington did after 2 terms as president of the United States, the first president, he knew that everything he did was setting a precedent for the future. And so after 2 terms, he walked away. Again, went back to his farm. Why? Well, I'm sure he was tired, but let's face it, it would be hard to walk away from that kind of power, that kind of adulation that he enjoyed. He knew he was setting a precedent for the future. He knew if I serve out my life here, then power-hungry men in the future will say, if I just get elected president, I can serve as long as I want. I can do whatever I want with no checks and balances. George Washington walked away so that we would be a free people. And we still have never had a dictator. To this day, 250 years in, Lord willing, that continues to be the case. But we owe that to the humility of one of the greatest men in our country. Now, what I don't want you to take away from this sermon is, well, good grief, I better go out and do some good deeds this week. I hope you do good deeds, but that's not enough. If you go out and help lots of people, if you do justice, if you love kindness, you know what's going to happen? You're going to become really proud of that, really self-righteous. You're going to walk around looking at people who are self-centered and people who are stingy, and you're going to judge them, and you're going to think you're the greatest person on earth. That's the way the human heart works. You can't win. So the only way to become great, the only way to have good character is to choose the one right hero. And that one right hero is the one who looked down on us and said, they are the least, they are the lost, and I'm going to come for them. The one who loved kindness enough to say, if in their shoes I would need a savior, I'm going to die in their place. The one who executed the greatest act of humility ever when he left a throne where he enjoyed the worship of legions of angels day and night and died the death of a slave so that we could live. And that person is Jesus. And you can't just put a poster of him on your wall or a cross around your neck and think, well, now I'll be like Jesus. No, you have to give him your life. You have to give your life to him, and then you're born again, and then you start to become like him. And it's a lifelong journey, but the longer you walk in his footsteps, the more like him you become. The longer you walk with him, the more you do justice and love kindness and walk humbly before your God.